Hello, my friend, and welcome to Pro Wrestling Daily. My name is Aaron Machbitz. Who are the top 5 most underrated wrestlers of all time? That's what I'm going to be breaking down in today's video. But before we get to that, I have some honorable mentions. If I were to make a top 10 or a top 15 list, these guys would be on it. And that includes, Bam Bam Bigelow, Raven, Goldust, Ted DiBiase, Marty Jannetty, D'Lo Brown, and William Regal. These wrestlers are underappreciated and deserve our respect and admiration, and I wanted to mention them before I jump in to my list. So here we go. The top 5 most underrated wrestlers of all time, beginning with number 5, which is the model Rick Martel. The model Rick Martel may not be mentioned as much as his golden era compadres, which is an absolute shame and why he's on this list. The Canadian import went all the way, totally all in with his self-centered, fashionista gimmick and could be very much relied on to look good in the ring, but more importantly, and more crucially as a heel, make his opponents shine as well. That's what made him great. He was the model Rick Martel, had a great gimmick, very charismatic, but really allowed his opponents to shine while also at times making himself look good and getting both parties over, himself and the babyface, right? His pure arrogance, gimmick, fragrance was amazing. And Rick Martel had the full package when it comes to being a sports entertainer, and that's why I believe he's the 5th most underrated wrestler of all time. And then we get into number 4, which is Dean Malenko. Dean Malenko, quite possibly the greatest pro wrestling technician of all time. Dean was the man of 1,000 holds, yet sadly, he may really be forgotten by this current generation of wrestling fans. Just really an effortlessly smooth performer. Everything he did was picture perfect in terms of timing and execution, and he was unbelievably efficient. But what seems to have held Dean Malenko back most of all was his inability to entertain sort of outside of the ring. Malenko was a pro wrestler, he was the definition of a pro wrestler, not really a sports entertainer. The model Rick Martel, sports entertainer. Dean Malenko, pro wrestler. And there's a huge difference and distinction between the two, right? To really be a star, you have to have all the tools inside the ring and outside the ring. Dean still was incredibly underrated, but he just didn't have or didn't build that ability to be that entertaining character outside of the ring to really expand his star power. And so it doesn't diminish how good he was. He's still incredibly underrated when it comes to how good he was inside of the squared circle and his influence on future generations. And then we go to number 3, which is Owen Hart. Owen Hart. Wow, enough is enough, and it's time for a change. The Hart family's quicker and snappier, WWE competitor could always be counted on to have a good match with pretty much anyone. His new generation run produced great matches with his brother Bret, the 1-2-3 Kid, and Shawn Michaels during his Attitude Era run. He continued to prove his worth against the likes of Triple H, Steve Blackman, and Ken Shamrock. Owen, who would have probably continued to have great having matches against newcomers that arrived in 2000 if it wasn't for his untimely, passing. So RIP to Owen. We keep his memory alive by remembering how good he was and also how underrated he was as a performer. We'll always look back on Owen as one of the most celebrated, yet still underrated WWE wrestlers to have ever lived. That's number 3 with Owen Hart. Then we move to number 2, Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect. Yes, Mr. Perfect is very popular, but I still think he's incredibly underrated when it comes to his ability and just what he brought to the ring as a performer, right? Curtis Michael Hennig embodied nothing but perfection once he returned to WWE during his second run. His transformation into what is now known as Mr. Perfect is the reason why so many wrestling fans remember him so fondly. His gimmick was so easy to hate, yet so easy to appreciate in hindsight now as a completely underrated performer. And his in-ring work was beautiful and captured everyone's attention, right? He had this over-the-top selling, and it's just a cherry on top for a wrestler who never bored anyone inside the ring, outside the ring with his vignettes. Like, ever when anyone watched him. He was amazing, and I still think he's completely underrated, right? After watching this man's bouts against Bret Hart, Ric Flair, and Hulk Hogan, you can't help but feel just a little bit angry at the fact that Mr. Perfect never claimed the WWF championship back in the day. And for that reason, I do think he's the second most underrated wrestler of all time. And then here we go. Number one, the number one most underrated wrestler of all time is Ravishing Rick Rude. Ravishing Rick Rude was absolutely incredible. Someone who influenced me as a professional wrestler very much. But it's a bit of a head scratcher as to, why Ravishing Rick Rude never won a WWE or WCW World Championship belt, right? Rick Rude was a great wrestler. He had amazing mustache, those airbrush tight pants where he used to put some of his opponents, on his tights, right? Gave him an original look. Like on all cylinders, he ticked off all the boxes. His work as a heel, specifically in WWE, was very entertaining, and Rude pulled it off perfectly, right? He also had this incredibly chiseled body, which even put over even more how ravishing he was. It's just, He was amazing in the ring. His work, again, as a heel was pulled off perfectly, relying heavily on his great charisma. Of course, his solid matches with Ultimate Warrior, Sting, and other well-known wrestlers were some of Rude's best moments. He was just incredible. He was ravishing, if you might say. He could deliver great matches against anybody in the business. Rick Rude did. He did win the Intercontinental Championship at WrestleMania, but Rude could have won many more titles than he did. Rick never provided a dull moment inside or outside the ring. He gave the Ultimate Warrior his best matches at the time and had had one of the best Intercontinental Championship runs in WWE history. He will always be remembered. He will always be remembered for his great work as the Ravishing One, and in my opinion, is the most underrated wrestler of all time. We talked about sort of the difference between pro wrestler and sports entertainer. Ravishing Rick Rude was a sports entertainer, but also had the chops to get it done in the ring, had the chops to get it done outside of the ring, could definitely have a great match with anyone, could definitely, one of the things that makes a great heel is their ability to slip on the banana peel and their ability to make themselves look stupid in the moment to put over the guy that they're wrestling, potentially the babyface. And Ravishing Rick Rude was one of the best at that. He wasn't afraid on slipping in the banana peel, knew that ultimately he could still maintain his credibility as an ass kicker and the Ravishing One, even if he slipped on the banana peel every once in a while. And so that's what makes a great heel. And so I think, just to recap, we had number 5, the model, Rick Martel. Then we had number 4, Dean Malenko. Number 3, Owen Hart. Number 2, Mr. Perfect. And number 1, Ravishing Rick Rude. Top 5 most underrated wrestlers of all time. They deserve our admiration. They deserve our respect. And they left a lasting legacy. And we have to remember their names as they have had impact on future generations. You can probably ask any professional wrestler going today if any of these guys impacted the way they move, sell, act, entertain, or wrestle in the ring. I guarantee you'll get a resounding yes. And so they're underrated, underappreciated, and some of my favorite performers of all time. And so it's very important for me to, give them that respect and admiration they deserve and highlight their careers, especially, one of my probably favorite wrestlers of all time, which is Ravishing Rick Rude. And so thanks for tuning in. If you disagree, agree, please comment below. I'd love to hear from you. And then share this with a friend, like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. I appreciate you very much. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.